is Lady B, and this week I am bringing you a recipe for a fortified eggnog for two sweetened with honey. Now, if that sounds familiar and you've seen some of my earlier videos, I'm kind of hoping you haven't, that would be because this was also the second video I ever made when I first started my channel. It's called Honey of Heaven, and I decided to redo it for two reasons. The first was, it was the second video I made when I started my channel, and I made mistakes both in the recipe and in the filming of the video. So I really needed to redo it. And the second is, it's delicious. It's really good. And so as I was looking through the recipe, and I thought, it's a recipe for two, it's February, and now I'm craving it. So here we are. Honey of Heaven. It's a recipe from the Calendar Book of Natural Beauty by Virginia Castleton. Now, if you've seen my other videos, you'll already be familiar with this book. It's all about bringing out your natural beauty through the use of diet, exercise, mainly yoga, and natural hair and skincare. And it has some great stuff in here. And one of the things that it does is every month it has a monthly aphrodisiac. Now, this is not always a recipe, and it's not really what most people would probably consider an aphrodisiac. This particular recipe, the Honey of Heaven, comes from January, the very first month. And in that, they go through and describe a little bit of the history of aphrodisiacs, how it started with Aphrodite and their worship, and how the Greeks came up with all kinds of things that they thought would enhance certain things. And some of them they just based on because they tasted really good. And in this case, in the book, the decision is to not concentrate on the more physical effects, but just to come up with recipes, in the case of the aphrodisiacs that are recipes, food recipes, that were sensual to the taste. And I have to say, I think they succeeded very much with this. So, give me a second and we'll get started. All right, here we are. Here we are in my kitchenette, where I have neither sink nor stove, but I do have, you can see the bottom of it right there, a fire extinguisher. Not that we're going to need it today. The only thing I'm going to be using down here right now is this blender. This is a very simple and easy recipe, and it is so delicious. And because it makes such a small amount, if you find yourself craving something rich, this is a great thing to turn to that you can just whip up really fast yourself in your own kitchen. And it's supposed to be good for you. And my guess is because of the ingredients. It's a little different than the standard eggnog. So the first thing we do is we use this blender and we put the first 4 ingredients in the blender. And that is 2 cups of milk. Now I'm using coconut milk because of allergies, but any milk will do. And 3/4 a cup of almond flour. And this is where I say it's fortified. This is probably one of the things that makes it more healthy. If you do keto with the honey, it doesn't quite qualify, but it kind of borderlines it. So it might be, if you reduce your sweetener, use an alternate sweetener, you could probably do keto with this. But here's the 3/4 of the almond flour. Now, I said it's an eggnog, so I have here 2 egg yolks. And those go into, don't worry, they will be cooked. Ooh. And they stuck. Get that in there. There we go. And then for flavoring, because it is an eggnog, we have a 1/4 teaspoon here of nutmeg. If you don't like nutmeg, you can leave it out. It's just fine. And it is also sticking. There we go. And now I'm just going to blend this for a few minutes. Sorry about the noise. Well, that was more like 30 seconds. All right, so I'm now going to take this though, and I'm going to pour this into a medium-sized pot. And you'll notice I have a whisk here, and there's a reason for that. Now the reason for the whisk is because my next step is to slowly beat in 3/4 cup of honey. Now I have reduced this to 1/2 cup. You could reduce it even more. Now honey is good for you, but it is strong. When you substitute for sugar with honey in recipes, do not use it straight across. My mother used honey when I was growing up because she was very concerned about her health. And we learned very quickly that when you're substituting with honey, it is sweeter than standard white sugar. So you can reduce it by 1/2 or even 1/3 as much as what it calls for. Now this recipe called for honey, so it's not a straight up substitution. I just reduced it because this is the amount I like when I make this recipe. Try it out yourself, figure out how sweet you like it. But either way, I have to pour this in while whisking. Now I heated this in the microwave until it was bubbling, so it is hot. And there is raw egg yolks in this, and that is why I have to do it slowly. I'm doing what's called tempering. I'm adding it a little bit at a time and whisking it so it doesn't cook any of that egg that's in it. So I will just whisk that in slowly. And as it is whisked in, it's going to bring up the temperature of the mixture that already is in there. And you can start adding more and more without risking it. But when you start out, you always, always, always start with just a little bit. So, now that this has been whisked in, I need to deal with my thickener. Now, technically, I could take this straight to the stove and slowly cook it, and the yolks in it would thicken it. But this is a very thick eggnog, and so it needs just a little bit more. And what that little bit more is a tablespoon of arrowroot. Now this is not actually arrowroot, this is tapioca flour, because I like the flavor better. Now arrowroot has this interesting property where while it's hot, it thickens, but as it cools, it loses its thickening ability. So I prefer to use a tapioca starch. It thickens it the same amount, but it doesn't lose that viscosity once it cools. Now, this particular recipe is meant to be served warm or hot, so that's not a problem. Arrowroot will work. If you have it, go ahead and use it. But like I said, I like the flavor of the tapioca starch better, so I'm using that. So what I need to do with this tapioca starch is I need to add more milk to it. And it says in the recipe to make it thin. Now normally when you're thickening with a starch, you do equal amounts. In this case, I'm going to want a little more of that because I want a nice thin slurry. So I'm going to pour that in and use the spoon to mix it until I get that thin slurry I'm looking for. And you do a little bit at a time so it's not lumpy. And it's not an exact amount. It's really up to you. This will be a very thick drink. And so the more liquid you add at this point, it will thin it down a little more. Also, I don't know, like I said, the yolks by themselves will thicken it a little bit. So if you don't like it as thick as this comes out, you can always just leave this part out. But that is what I was looking for. You can see I have this thin slurry. Just make sure there's no lumps. And now I am going to whip this into here as well. It says to mix it in and then mix well. Blend it in and mix well, I believe is how the recipe states it. So, there we go. Now, the last thing I need to do is take this to the stove in the other room and heat it on low until it comes to, let's see, until it thickens. Now, basically, I am making a custard here. And when you're making a custard, it's very simple, easy way to tell when you have the right thickness. And that is because what you do is you take a spoon and you dip your spoon in it and you let it sheet off the back of your spoon. And if it coats it beautifully across the whole back of the spoon and comes off in sheets rather than dribbles, then you have reached the point where your yolks are cooked and you have a custard. Because really, when you get down to it, an eggnog is really just a custard drink. So I'm going to go do that right now. 10 or 15 minutes of stirring on a hot stove. Simmer. Do not boil. If once it comes up to temperature, do not let it boil or you will end up with scrambled eggs. But other than that, you just stir it. And here we have it, 2 servings of Honey of Heaven fortified eggnog. If you took out or left out the almond flour and used sugar instead of honey, it would just basically be an eggnog. But those 2 ingredients make such a difference, and it is, oh, so good. So, I love you all, whether new or old. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next week. Until then, whether cooking, recipes for 2, or anything else, don't be afraid to suit yourself and make whatever you do exclusively you. I always unplug my appliances as soon as I'm done with them. Try it again. I always unplug my appliances as soon as I'm finished with them. To stir it. Let's try it. Someone keeps walking around. Okay, so the reason for this